Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the authors and editors discuss news and events with a splash of history. Our host today is Dan Masterson. Joining him is Jim Dunnigan, well-known military author and the Dean of Wargaming. Also, joining today's show is columnist and author retired Colonel Austin Bay.
Gentlemen, I thought we would talk a little bit about the Quad this morning, or Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. That is a mouthful, but basically it's a dialogue between India, the U.S., Australia, and Japan about military and security matters. Why do they need to do this, Jim?
Well, because they have to confront China. China is bent on, taking control of the South China Sea and much else besides. And China doesn't want a war because a war would be disastrous for their economy. They depend upon imports of oil and food to run their industries and to feed their people. So they have to basically, how should I put it, finesse the situation. They have to convince their opponents that it's in their interest somehow to let China have what it wants. And of course, the subjects, as it were, do not want to give China what it wants. And so right now there's sort of a standoff between China and its opponents, the Quad, over what China can have and what it can't have. And right now the Quad is winning. China is basically stymied, and I don't know if that's going to change any.
Austin, do you see the necessity for the Quad?
Well, Japan certainly does. I think 2007 was where the Quad, quote unquote, began with Japanese diplomats approaching Indian diplomats at a conference and made the suggestion, we have a common problem. You have a problem with China along that long northern frontier and Chinese claims on your land. China claims islands that we say belong to Japan, and Japan has a excellent legal claim to those islands. Australia and the U.S. are at odds. They're our allies, bilateral to the United States, but the U.S., Japanese, Australian alliance is very strong. And it's in your interest to, we think, the way the Japanese say they approached it, they said, we're speaking in our interest, but we think you have common interest with us. So let's start talking about it. Over the years, and let's see, when they had a couple of exercises in the Indian Ocean, where every year the Indian Navy has a series of naval exercises. And suddenly you'd see U.S. ships show up, an Australian destroyer would be participating, or at least participating in an anti-air exercise, and the Japanese would have observers. And then Indian naval ships ended up participating in exercises with the Japanese. It was not, India has had a tradition since independence of going what they call the third way. They were major movers in the non-aligned, so-called non-aligned movement during the Cold War. But look back, China invades Tibet in 1950. The Sino-Indian War of 1962 isn't over. They've got a ceasefire. There's still discussions about a permanent line, but China really doesn't want a permanent line because it claims land that goes past through the Himalayan passes, and India says that those belong to us. And it's China has been consistently improving the road network, airfields, and the like along that border with China. So Japan was absolutely right. The Japanese were right to make that move, and they were the ones to do it in this case, even though Australia and India have lots of common defense operations. And it gives China a huge strategic problem. They can't just focus on the South China Sea and Japan and breaking through the first island barrier, as they say, or asserting their rights. It was the 9-dash line, Dan. Now it's the 10-dash line. They're showing maps with a dash on the other side of Taiwan. And there's a fifth. Sometimes the Quad is called the Quint. You add Singapore to it because Singapore sees itself, and I think correctly, as China's strategic objective in the South China Sea. You push that dash line, the 10-dash line now, a little bit further down, and there's the Straits of Malacca and Singapore.
Could you explain the dash line? Why do they call it the 9-dash?
Okay. Fair question. Actually, this has been written up on strategy page 2 or 3 times. Delighted to do it. China follows it practices lawfare, and part of lawfare, legal fare, is map fare, I guess, map warfare. They publish maps with Chinese names on places that they claim that once belonged to the Chinese emperor, and they still belong to China. Certainly, the one that's most blatant was the so-called 9-dash line. When they published it, it had 9 dashes in it, defining how much of the South China Sea, virtually all of it, China claimed as its own, really territorial waters, and a complete violation of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, of which China is a signatory. It's blatant, how do you call this, cartographic imperialism is what it was, to set out media warfare, narrative warfare, information warfare, that here's what we claim, pass it around to their own people, but to everybody else, at least get it out there that this is Chinese territory by Beijing's claim, not by Vietnam's, Thailand's, Brunei, Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines, and Japan, and Taiwan, but by Beijing, the Chinese Communist Party. So the maps became colloquially known as 9-dash line, because sign meaning China's claim to this huge, vast sea area. And now there's 10 lines because the first one, 9, didn't include Taiwan, and now because China's become more aggressive with Taiwan, there's a line behind to the east of Taiwan, so they're calling it a 10-dash line. But it's information warfare tied to illegal claims, diplomatic claims, and China passes it around when it gets into a fight with the Philippines over like this new shoal that they're building, constructing an artificial island on, which they're claiming, and it's Philippines Exclusive Economic Zone, EEZ, very clearly. And Beijing completely ignores the 2016 Hague Arbitration Court ruling that basically said China has stolen Filipino territory, maritime territory, and stolen sea resources, including fishing. 98% of the Philippines' claim, which I think it was filed in 2013, was upheld by the court, and China just ignored it. It's lawless, absolutely lawless. Another reason to get back to the Quad. Japan saw this coming with the battles it has with China over the Senkaku Islands, and China even has a claim to Okinawa, supposedly. The Japanese saw an opportunity, knew the Indians, it must have been some crosstalk among diplomats saying, we do have a common problem. And this really imperialist aggression is what it is. It's a return to the establishing the Chinese Empire as they're attempting to do it on all avenues, information, diplomatic, certainly economic and military. And having India in a military relationship with the U.S., Japan, Australia, and I'll add Singapore, really gives the most aggressive Chinese a second thought, because now any of these lines of logistical lines that they're trying to create on a Belt and Road Initiative, but long distance logistics connections to Southwest Asia, to Iran and the like, those can be interdicted by the Indians. Indians already can interdict their sea lines of communication and trade, because I mean it's the Indian Ocean for a reason. That huge peninsula juts right out in the middle of it, and the Indian Navy is pretty potent.
Jim, what have been how do I say this? The encounters between the Chinese Navy and the Quad?
They've become increasingly aggressive. There was recently a confrontation between the Filipino Coast Guard and the Chinese Navy and Coast Guard, in which at least one man was killed. I mean, they were basically fighting with fists, with clubs and what have you. They've done that on land. They did it up in the Himalayas. By the way, China also is claiming the northeastern Indian province of Arunachal Pradesh. So the Chinese claims apparently grow year by year, and it just infuriates more people. Now, China doesn't want to go to war. China cannot afford a war, but China feels that this is an ancient Chinese practice. You keep pushing, and eventually the enemy will just walk away. You wear them out, and it's a question of whether it'll work here. I doubt it will, because we're talking about Taiwan and the Philippines' very existence as independent countries. The latest Chinese line goes into the areas off northern Philippines that contain some subaquatic mineral resources, as well as the fishing. So China wants it all, and it's going to keep pushing until it gets it. The rest of the world is basically dedicated to frustrating China for as long as it takes. Well, it's probably just forever, because China will keep on going until there's a new government, which probably won't happen anytime soon. I mean, China has economic problems and political problems, but they always seem to find a way to get out of it. Then again, you have to remember that China was a how should I put it, disorganized state, as it were, in the early 20th century. And it wasn't until 1949 that the communists won a civil war and united it all. But it can all come apart again. And that's something that Chinese worry about. China, throughout its history, has been more often separated into several different kingdoms than as the United States. So the Chinese have to worry about themselves as well as their opponents.
Austin, do you see let me start this over. Austin, do you see any potential conflict immediately between China and the Quad?
What do you mean by immediately, Dan?
Within the next year?
Next year, no, but there is a window of opportunity, and I think that window of opportunity began 2022, 2023 for Beijing, for the Chinese Communist Party. I'll call it that. That extends 2030, 2031. I used to think it would run from about 2022 to 2027, 2028, but the things that I have seen in the let's call it free countries, Quad being an example of four of the free countries that oppose China, have either been distracted by other conflicts, Middle East, Ukraine, or have, for economic reasons, have not modernized their military forces. Now, I'm going to make one other comment on that. Nevertheless, I think almost all of free nations now recognize the threat that China poses. You can see that in Europe, and including getting sick of the way China uses a really aggressive corruption tactics. Give an example of that. The latest advisor to a senior American official, in this case, the governor of New York, had a communist spy working for her, that was redirecting state funds away from investments in Taiwan, among other things, as well as providing intelligence. It's not when I say that that's almost a classic spy operation, but China funds all kinds of disruptive political operations, even ones that they may on the surface disagree with, just to cause havoc in democratic polities in free countries. Getting sick of that. But get back to the big threat, the military threat. Yeah, Jim and I disagree on China going to war. I agree with him that China doesn't need a war. China doesn't want a war. It'd be very damaging to China, and I don't think that they would achieve what they would want to achieve, even taking Taiwan. But when you become as economically weakened as China is right now, with all these dysfunctional components of that massive economy, it's huge. It's number 2 on the planet, very powerful, very, very productive, but nevertheless misallocated capital, no real wealth. There is a home Chinese market, but people aren't buying. There's a deflation. Deflation is occurring now. I think there's enough evidence to say that China's going through a deflationary period. And you're looking at the Chinese Communist Party losing its biggest domestic card, which was, we'll let you get rich and have iPhones and computers and travel a little bit, but party stays in charge. Well, what happens when the deflation hits and you have a depression? The other card that the Chinese Communist Party has built is ultranationalism. And that is because Marxism's nothing to believe in anymore. Yeah, you can believe in materialism and making money as long as you're making money. But the other is this Chinese nationalism. And really what it is ethnic Han nationalism. And it's based on grievance, and that the world has been cruel to China, and that China is reestablishing its authority in areas that really belong to China, regions, territories. That's part of all the little pushing and the lawfare and the intelligence operations and all those threats, as Jim pointed out, to India. But it's not just in the East. There's a fight in the Western sector as well. Those, you get a huge disruption, economic disruption at home, and then what do you do to stay in power? You have a border war, and maybe you have a big border war. I don't think the Chinese, I don't think Beijing wants a war with India, but they've done so much threatening with Taiwan. They make a move and they take Kinmen, which is Quemoy. I did a column on this a few weeks ago. Or Matsu. I mean, those famous places Nixon and Kennedy debated trying to defend them in 1960. They make that move because they're indefensible, really. And I've been to Kinmen. I mean, you can see China through this bunker slit that empty. It was an empty bunker, unmanned. It hadn't been used in a couple of decades. But through the slit, mainland China was a mile and a half, 2 miles away. And a bunch of guys, and they weren't fishing boats. They were people out in little boats fishing out there. That's how peaceful it was in 2002. But it's indefensible. And it's, quote unquote, sovereign Taiwanese territory. They grabbed those. There are other places that they could make moves. They're already making their moves against the Philippines. And when you were asking Jim about is there any place that they're having a confrontation, Jim brought up the Philippines. Philippines not part of the Quad, except, bilateral defense treaty with the United States. So maybe it's Quad 0.5. You could bring in the U.S. has a bilateral defense treaty with Thailand as well. and you look down at Brunei, the Sultanate of Brunei, with all that oil, it's got a very strong bilateral defense treaty with Great Britain. It's still the Sultanate. It's still on a defense level has ties with the British Commonwealth. So not that Britain's part of the Quad, but it is part of AUKUS, Australian, UK, U.S. Nuclear submarine deal, which is a very big deal for the Australians acquiring U.S. British type nuclear attack submarines. So, do I see China? Do I see a scenario where China chooses war? And I do, and it's one that is very dangerous. It's limited. In other words, to quote unquote achieve national objectives. But it's also one that if it starts it and Taiwan shoots back, the U.S. Fearing a all-out assault on Taiwan, you have all U.S. capabilities seeding mines into the Taiwan Strait. Japan active in it. South Korea, fearing that North Korea is going to use the chaos to launch a nuclear attack. Suddenly you've got a conflagration, and it's something that can't be written off as fantasy. Every single one of the examples I gave there's a heavy degree of friction. There's a lot of you see the way the South Koreans look at China and North Korea. They have reason to be a nation in arms, which is what they are. And I can see a blow up. I can see a shooting between the People's Liberation Army Navy plan and the USN, and with the Japanese Navy. Does it kick off with India? I think China would be in this situation very, very careful not to kick off another fight with the Indians. But I do see that. Maybe not within the next year, but it's all those pieces, they're embers, Dan, and you make a move like I suggested that China could do, thinking there's very little blowback, and suddenly it explodes. It's a powder keg.
Jim, are there other East Asian countries that are interested in being part of the Quad or something like it that's larger?
Well, every East Asian country opposes China. Many of them do not want to officially become part of an anti-Chinese alliance, but in practical terms, they do belong to an anti-Chinese alliance. Another thing you got to keep in mind is China has one major weakness. They are absolutely dependent on imports of fuel and food to keep their population, their industry working and the population fed. If they lose that, and that they could lose that simply by declaring war, and bingo, as Austin pointed out, the Americans would mine, areas that the Chinese, merchant shipping travels to. There would be uproars inside China. The factories would not be operating. People would be a food shortage. That is a dangerous thing to play with. So the Chinese basically act aggressively at their peril.
Dan, I would hope that the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing would listen to this podcast and hear what Jim said. Even though when I come out with that scenario, and it's something that has to be considered, you have to be prepared for it militarily and diplomatically. I think the Chinese the Chinese Communist Party would end up regretting it immensely. Nevertheless, if they face intense domestic resistance because of a collapsing economy, that's something that the more militaristic leaders might choose.
Well, we'll wrap it up there. I'm sure we'll be talking about things happening in Southeast Asia and Asia in the future. We'll see you next time, gentlemen.
Okay, in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, guys.